I woke up to the smell of coffee just a shade too bitter, that sharp burnt edge that meant I'd let the percolator run a minute longer than I should. It was late October, Kentucky cold sneaking through the window frames, and the old floorboards in our kitchen ticked as the heat kicked on. Margaret hummed Blue Moon of Kentucky under her breath while she buttered toast, and Clara sat cross-legged at the table, drawing a sun in orange crayon that refused to stay inside the lines. I remember the cheap vinyl chair creaking as I sat, the steam fogging my glasses, the world so ordinary it shines in my memory like a coin you can't stop turning over. Then the phone rang. Not our wall phone, the one with the curly cord. My pocket one, a buzz that felt urgent. "Eddie, it's Harold," came the voice of my boss, clipped and dry as cut paper. "I need you here now. No good morning, no please." Just the sound of a man used to being obeyed. I looked at Margaret. She paused, knife in the air, the butter glistening. "Everything okay?" she asked. I swallowed the wrong way and coughed. "Probably inventory," I said, because back then I believed in tidy answers. I believed in clocks that kept time and ledgers that balanced if you looked long enough. "Daddy, look," Clara said, holding up the sun. "You made it too big," I teased, and she made a face, and her front tooth was still missing, and she was perfect. I kissed Margaret's temple. She smelled like ivory soap and something warm from the oven. "Be right back," I said, reaching for my coat. Kentucky sky slate gray. The elm in our yard shaking its last leaves like a tiny parade for one. I didn't know that would be the last time I saw my mug on that hook by the stove for a very, very long time. I didn't know the mug would gather dust behind police tape. I didn't know the next time I came home, my hands would tremble as if they belonged to someone else. Because when I pulled into Benton Manufacturing, 2 patrol cars already sat at odd angles by the steps, lights off, engines ticking like cooling hearts, and I felt the first small rip in the fabric of my life. Inside, the lobby smelled of machine oil and floor cleaner, a scent I always thought of as honest, the smell of work. But the receptionist, Luann, wouldn't meet my eyes. Her lipstick was smeared like she'd pressed her lips too hard together to stop a secret from escaping. I gave her a small wave anyway, that Kentucky politeness that sticks even when your gut says turn around. "Mr. Benton's waiting," she said, voice thin. The hallway felt longer than usual, the fluorescent lights buzzing like fat flies above my head. On the corkboard, a notice about a potluck, a faded flyer for a softball game we'd lost in August, a Polaroid of us grinning with ketchup stains, and then Harold's door already open. He stood behind his desk with the blinds half closed, stripes of grey light cutting across his face. "Eddie," he said, and next to him was Daniel, his son, leaning against the filing cabinet like it owed him money. Daniel had that lazy smile he used when he was about to say something mean. "Sit down," Harold said. I stayed standing. "What's this about?" I asked. My voice sounded softer than I meant it to, like I was the child in the room. "Where is it?" Harold asked. "Where is what?" "Don't." He put his hands flat on the desk, the skin on his knuckles pale as milk. $147,000, Eddie. He said the number like it was a cuss word. "It's gone." "Then someone made a mistake," I said. "I can—" "Detective Holt is on his way," Harold cut in. "We've been going over the books with Daniel all morning." Daniel tapped a folder against his thigh. "All morning," he repeated, like an echo designed to bruise. I turned to him. "Show me," I said. He opened the folder and let papers slide onto the desk. Photocopies of ledger sheets, checks with my initials, transfers I'd never authorized. My initials. My handwriting. I felt the room tilt. "These aren't right," I said. "This isn't—" "Save it," Harold said, and his voice did something I'd never heard before. It cracked. "I trusted you." Behind me, shoes squeaked in the hall. Paul Granger appeared, colorless, holding a styrofoam cup as if it were a shield. "Eddie," he whispered. I reached for one of the pages, and the paper looked back at me with my own looping L from Lawson, and my stomach turned hot then cold. I knew the truth inside my bones, but I also knew that paper is a cruel storyteller, the kind folks believe when a man's word isn't enough. A siren wailed somewhere close, then cut off, and before I could choose fight or flight, the shadows of 2 men passed the frosted glass like slow clouds, and a knuckle rapped the door, and the life I'd built took one step back from me, as if it were preparing to run. Detective Raymond Holt didn't bother with introductions. He smelled faintly of cigarettes and wet wool, and his eyes did that cop thing, cataloguing the room like an inventory. Desk, chair, family photo, me. He flipped a badge, not long enough to read the number. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "we're going to need you to come with us." I heard Margaret's voice in my head. "Call me if you'll be late," and for a second, petty as a child, I wanted to say I had to pick up milk. "I can explain," I said, "because that's what innocent men say when they still think explanations matter." Holt nodded like he'd been expecting the line. "You can explain downtown." "He didn't do this," Paul blurted, then shrank back when Holt's partner, stockier, quiet, looked at him. Harold watched the floor. Daniel adjusted his tie. I thought of Clara's orange sun, too big for the page. "At least let me see the sheets," I tried again. Holt took a pair of zip ties from his pocket and held them like a reminder. "Hands," he said. The air in the room changed. Everyone taller than me, everyone farther away. I lifted my wrists and the plastic cinched with a little scream. It stung. It still stings in memory. "Eddie," Harold finally said, but my name sounded like a verdict. I turned to him. "Harold," I asked, stupidly hopeful, "you believe me?" His mouth opened and closed. The blinds striped his face. And the truth is, I loved that man in the way workers love a man who fed their families. He didn't answer. Holt's hand on my shoulder was surprisingly gentle. "Let's go," he said. The hallway swam with curious faces. Luann cried soundlessly. Paul stared at his shoes. I counted ceiling tiles to keep from breaking. Outside, the sky had decided to drizzle, that fine Kentucky rain that makes everything smell like metal. They put me in the back of the car. The door thunked shut, and the world went muffled like I'd put my head under bathwater. Through the glass, I saw Daniel lean into Harold, say something quick. Harold didn't look up as the car rolled. I watched Benton Manufacturing, my second home, my pride, get smaller in the rear window until it turned into a square of gray, and then into nothing. I imagined Margaret hanging Clara's coat by the door. I imagined my coffee cooling on the counter. I imagined a version of the day where I never picked up that phone. But this was the day I picked it up. This was the day the numbers lied and the paper won. And as the wipers dragged two tired arcs across the windshield, Holt glanced at me in the mirror and said, like a man pointing out weather, "You know, Mr. Lawson, folks don't take this kind of money by accident." I looked at my trembling hands, and answered, "I didn't take a single dime." He didn't argue. He didn't need to, because the station was already waiting, and so was the first lock I'd ever hear close behind me. Before everything went wrong, my life had a rhythm that felt unbreakable. You don't notice the music of routine until it stops playing. The soft percussion of mornings, the hum of the radio on the drive to work, the smell of sawdust and grease that clung to my clothes. I used to joke that Benton Manufacturing was my second home, though some days I spent more hours there than in my own living room. I'd arrive before dawn, unlock the accounting office, and let the fluorescent light hum me awake. The ledger books sat stacked by the window, lined in neat green columns that I'd fill like prayer lines. Numbers made sense to me. Clean, loyal things that always told the truth. At least I thought they did. Harold Benton, my boss, would walk in around 8 sharp, holding his thermos like a trophy. He was a man who believed punctuality was next to godliness. "Morning, Eddie," he'd say, tapping the doorway with his ring as he passed, the sound quick and metallic. I respected him, maybe even admired him. He'd started the company from nothing. 1 truck, a second-hand lathe, and a loan the bank almost didn't approve. He told that story every Christmas party, voice thick with bourbon and pride. I always smiled, even when I'd heard it 20 times. Daniel, his son, usually stood in the corner during those speeches, arms crossed, pretending to laugh at the right moments. He was slick, sharp-dressed, the kind of man who never got his hands dirty but took credit when others did. Still, I tried to like him, maybe because Harold wanted me to. Those were good years, mostly. Margaret taught 2nd grade at the elementary school down the street, and Clara had just started 4th. Our evenings were small, gentle things. Dinner at 6, Jeopardy at 7, and sometimes a walk if the air was soft enough. Margaret would talk about her students, their misspelled words and missing homework, while I fixed a loose hinge or balanced the checkbook. It was a quiet kind of happiness, not loud or showy, just steady, the way a porch light burns through the dark. I used to lie awake some nights listening to the clock tick in our hallway, thinking how lucky I was to have such an ordinary life. I didn't know then that ordinary can vanish faster than breath, and when it does, you'd give anything to hear that same clock tick again. Fridays at the office always carried a kind of restless buzz. Paydays, you could smell the grease of fried chicken from someone's lunch bag, hear the muffled laughter from the break room. I used to sit by the big window near the back, where you could see the rail tracks slicing through the industrial park. Freight trains came by like old promises, loud, dependable, fading too fast. I'd count the cars as they passed. Sometimes Daniel would stroll over, lean against my desk and flip through the reports I was compiling. "You're still doing this by hand?" he'd say, half smiling. "We should digitize the books, Eddie, get with the times." I'd shrug. "These hands haven't failed me yet." I meant it. There was pride in those calluses, in the ink that sometimes bled onto my cuffs. He'd smirk, toss the papers back and wander off, always smelling faintly of cologne and ambition. Paul Granger, my closest thing to a friend there, would swing by with coffee around 10. "Your wife still baking that banana bread?" he'd ask, grinning. "You tell her she's spoiling the whole department." Paul was a good man, quiet, funny, and just cautious enough to survive anywhere. He used to talk about moving to Florida someday. "Once I hit 60, I'm done with these winters," he'd say, blowing on his coffee. I'd laugh and tell him he'd miss the Kentucky snow, though truth be told I probably wouldn't have. The truth is, I loved the smallness of our lives, the simple things that never asked questions, the smell of paper ink, the creak of my office chair, the steady paycheck that meant Clara could have piano lessons. On the day before everything fell apart, Harold had stopped by my desk to hand me a bonus envelope. "Couldn't run this place without you," he said, smiling in that fatherly way. I remember how the paper felt, heavy, smooth, and how proud I was to bring it home. Margaret hugged me that night, her eyes soft. "You deserve every penny," she whispered. We talked about maybe repainting the porch come spring. Clara wanted a dog. I told her maybe next year, if things stayed steady at the plant. I wish I'd said yes right then. I wish I'd known how close we were to losing everything that made life simple. That weekend, a storm rolled through, thunder so low it shook the windows, rain smearing the world into watercolor. I spent Saturday fixing the gutter and Sunday reading the paper by the fire. The story on the front page was about a local man accused of embezzlement, a banker who'd siphoned funds for years. Margaret shook her head. "People can't get enough, can they?" she said. I laughed, not cruelly, just without thought. Greed catches everyone eventually. I didn't know those words would haunt me. I didn't know greed had already found its way into my own world, into my boss's house, his son's hands, my name on their papers. Sunday night, Clara asked me to check under her bed for monsters. I did, of course. There was nothing there but an old doll and a pair of mismatched socks. "See, all clear," I told her, tucking the blanket to her chin. "You're safe," she smiled, eyes half closed. "You always keep me safe, Daddy." I stayed there a moment longer than usual, watching her breathe, the rise and fall of her small chest. I wanted to freeze time right there, before the call, before the accusations, before everything turned inside out, because the next morning, when the sun rose weak and pale through our curtains, the air in the house felt different, still but charged, like the pause before lightning strikes. Margaret made oatmeal instead of eggs. The radio played softly, an old country tune about losing what you love. I tied my tie and thought just for a second that the world felt too quiet. I couldn't name it then, but looking back, I think some part of me knew. Some part of me felt the current shifting beneath my feet. And when that phone rang, slicing through the calm like a blade, the storm I'd been pretending not to see finally came crashing down. They sat me down in that grey room that smelled of metal and sweat, the kind of smell that never really leaves you, even after the air changes. Detective Holt dropped a manila folder onto the table so hard that dust lifted into the light. "You know why you're here, Lawson," he said. His voice wasn't angry, just bored, like he'd already written the ending. I told him the truth, straight and plain. "I don't know what this is about." He flipped open the folder. Inside, photocopies, signatures, my initials. Each page stamped with dates and numbers I recognized but didn't. "You managed payroll," he said. "You handled deposits." "For 15 years, I answered, "and not a single dime's ever gone missing until now." Holt leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Until now," he repeated, slow and heavy. Behind him, a small fan hummed, pushing stale air in circles. I remember staring at those papers, my handwriting except not. Someone had traced my style, my slanted L, the curve of my S. My stomach twisted. "This isn't me," I said, tapping one of the pages. "Then who is it?" Holt asked, not as a question but as a trap. I thought of Daniel, but the idea felt too dangerous to say aloud. He was the boss's son, untouchable. The kind of man who could make a story disappear. "You think I'm stupid?" Holt asked when I hesitated. "These transfers went straight to an account opened under your address." "That's impossible," I said, my voice cracking. "We'll see." He stood, motioning to his partner. "Let's get his prints." As they led me out, I saw Paul standing by the vending machine, his coffee untouched, his eyes wide. "Paul," I said, "you know me." He opened his mouth but said nothing. Later I'd understand that silence, how fear makes good men small. They fingerprinted me, took my belt, my watch, even my wedding ring. The metal tray clattered when I set it down. The officer on duty said, "Don't worry, you'll get it all back," and I wanted to believe him. But I never saw that ring again. Margaret came to the station 2 hours later. She looked like she hadn't taken a full breath since the phone call. Her hands shook when she reached for mine through the bars of the holding cell. "Eddie," she whispered, "what's happening?" I tried to sound calm, for her, for Clara. "It's a mistake. Some numbers mixed up. They'll figure it out." Her eyes searched mine, desperate to find the man she married still in there. They said you took money." Her voice cracked on the last word. "You know me," I said. "You know me." She nodded, but her tears said she was afraid, not of me, but of what the world was about to do to us. Then Harold appeared, flanked by Detective Holt. His suit looked heavier than usual, shoulders slumped. For a second I thought maybe he'd come to fix it, to say it was all a misunderstanding. But when he looked at me, it wasn't anger I saw. It was disappointment, thick and final. "I never wanted it to come to this," he said. "But the evidence—" "Harold," I interrupted, "you've known me half my life." "I also know you've been under pressure," he replied softly. "Your girl's school, the mortgage—" "Oh, don't you dare," I said. "You think I'd steal from you?" He couldn't meet my eyes. "You'll have your chance in court." Then he turned, and something broke inside me that never quite healed. After they left, Margaret whispered, "I'll get a lawyer." But we couldn't afford one. So the court gave me one instead, a man named Brian Keene, young and tired, who smelled of coffee and defeat. "We'll try for a plea deal," he said after 10 minutes of looking at my file. "I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do," he sighed. "They have ledgers, bank transfers, even handwriting analysis. A jury's not going to like those odds." "Then we show them the truth," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, then wrote something down. "Truth," he said under his breath, like he'd forgotten what it sounded like. The local paper ran the story the next morning. "Accountant accused of $147,000. Embezzlement from Benton Manufacturing." My name was printed twice, once in the headline, once in the third paragraph, right next to betrayal of trust. I still remember the sound of the newsstand bell that day, when a stranger picked up a copy, glanced at my mugshot and shook his head. That sound followed me for decades. Margaret tried to keep Clara from seeing it, but kids always find out. A week later, when they came to visit, Clara sat in her mother's lap, eyes wide. "Mommy says you didn't do it," she said. "That's right, sweetheart," I told her. "Then why are you here?" That question stayed with me longer than any sentence a judge could hand down. The arraignment came fast. I stood in that courtroom with its tall windows and peeling paint, the air thick with whispers. Harold was there, Daniel too, sitting stiffly behind the prosecutor. I kept waiting for Daniel to flinch, to shift in his chair, to look guilty. He didn't. He just smiled once, small, private, when our eyes met. That's when I knew, not in theory, not in fear, but in bone-deep certainty. He'd done it. He'd used my trust, my name, my careful handwriting, and I was the one standing in chains. The gavel came down with a hollow crack. "Bail denied," the judge said. Margaret cried quietly. My lawyer put a hand on my shoulder, like that meant something. They led me out the side door, my cuffs biting against skin already raw. I turned once, hoping Harold would look up, hoping for a sign that he'd seen the lie. He didn't. He just stared at the floor. That night, lying on the thin cot of the county jail, the noise of men echoing down the corridor. I tried to remember the sound of Clara's laugh. I couldn't. All I could hear was that single, sharp click when the lock turned, the first of many. And in that moment I finally understood. This wasn't a mistake to be fixed by morning. This was a storm that had come to stay. The courthouse in Lexington had those kind of ceilings that made you feel small. Arches that swallowed sound. Marble floors polished so clean you could see your fear reflected back at you. They dressed me in a wrinkled suit 2 sizes too big, the collar rough against my neck, and led me through the side entrance so the press wouldn't catch me stumbling in handcuffs. I could still hear their voices outside, though, muffled but sharp. The embezzler from Benton Manufacturing. Flashbulbs popped behind the doors like lightning. I'd never been in a courtroom before that day, and I swear the air itself knew I didn't belong there. Brian Keene, my public defender, shuffled papers beside me. He was young, too young, and already tired of me. "The plea's still open," he whispered, not meeting my eyes. "5 years if you admit guilt." "I didn't steal anything," I said. "And I won't say I did." He sighed, scribbling something I couldn't read. "Then this will be hard." He was right. It was hard in ways I couldn't imagine yet. When the bailiff called State of Kentucky versus Edward Lawson, my name echoed off the walls like a sentence all its own. Prosecutor Linda Dorsey stood tall, confident, her voice smooth as glass. "This is a case," she began, "about betrayal." She spoke of trust broken, of a company nearly ruined, of an employee who saw opportunity and loyalty. She never once looked at me. She didn't need to. The jury already was. 12 strangers who'd read my name in the paper, who'd seen my photograph under a headline that said thief. Harold Benton sat on the front row, shoulders stiff, his wife clutching a handkerchief like it was the last clean thing left in the world. Daniel sat beside him, eyes calm, face unreadable. When my turn came to testify, Brian told me to keep it simple. "The jury likes humble," he said. So I told the truth, how I handled payroll, how the ledgers were kept, how anyone with access could have made the transfers. "Who had access?" Dorsey asked, circling me like a hawk. "You, Mr. Benton, and his son," I said. She smiled. "And which of those 3 people signed every transfer?" "Someone forged my initials." "Forged them?" she asked, tilting her head. Even the handwriting expert disagrees. She held up an enlarged copy of my supposed signature. "That's your writing, isn't it?" I looked at it. Those looping letters, my L that leaned too far right. It looked like mine. God help me, it looked like mine. The jury leaned forward as if the truth could be seen in the ink. "It's not," I said, though the word felt weak the moment it left my lips. She nodded, pretending pity. "Mr. Lawson, do you expect this court to believe that you, after 15 years of spotless work, suddenly had your signature imitated on every falsified document, and you never noticed?" "Yes," I said quietly. The room erupted in whispers. Margaret sat behind the defense table every day, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. I used to turn to her between recesses, trying to draw strength from her eyes, but each day I saw her belief falter just a little. The prosecutor paraded witness after witness, bank tellers, auditors, even Paul Granger. Poor Paul looked sick, sweat dripping down his temples. "Mr. Granger," Dorsey said, "did you ever notice anything unusual in Mr. Lawson's behavior?" "No," he said quickly, then hesitated. "Well, he was under stress. He mentioned bills once." The courtroom murmured. My stomach dropped. Paul wouldn't meet my eyes. When the defense's turn came, Brian called me again, but his questions were small, nervous things. "Mr. Lawson, did you steal the money?" "No." "Did you benefit from it?" "No." "That's all," he said. That was all. During recess, I watched Daniel whisper to his father. Harold's face hardened with every word. I wanted to shout, to tell them to look deeper, to check Daniel's accounts, but my lawyer wouldn't hear it. "We don't accuse the boss's son without proof," he warned. "It'll make you look desperate." But I was desperate. Every night in that cheap motel cell they kept me in during the trial, I dreamed of Clara asking me the same question over and over. "Daddy, why did you take it?" I'd wake up with that question stuck to my throat like a stone. By the 3rd week, the trial had become a spectacle. Reporters crowded the hallways. Sketch artists filled the front benches, and even strangers came to watch me fall apart. Harold took the stand, his voice trembling as he said, "I loved Eddie like a son. That's what makes this so painful. It was the final nail. The prosecutor didn't need to prove anything else. His words were enough to bury me. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. I remember because it rained that morning. Steady, cold, the kind that soaks through everything. I thought maybe it was a sign that something would wash clean. The jury filed in, eyes down. The foreman stood. We find the defendant, Edward Lawson, guilty on all counts. The sound that left Margaret's throat was small but sharp. I turned to her. She was crying silently, holding the handkerchief she'd carried since day one. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat, voice like stone. Mr. Lawson, you have betrayed the trust of your employer, your community, and your family. This court sentences you to 40 years in the custody of the state of Kentucky. The world tilted. My ears filled with rushing blood. 40 years. I was 30 at the time. I did the math without meaning to. Clara would be almost 50 when I got out. Margaret would be old. My parents might not even live that long. 40, I whispered, but no one heard. The gavel came down like thunder, final and merciless. As they led me away, Margaret reached out, fingertips brushing mine. I'll fight, she said through tears. I'll fight for you. I wanted to believe her, but I'd seen how tired she'd become. Outside, the reporters shouted questions, flashes blinding me, as they pushed for a better shot of the criminal in cuffs. I didn't cry. I just walked one foot in front of the other, because falling apart felt like something I hadn't yet earned the right to do. In the van, heading toward the penitentiary for intake, I looked out the barred window at the rain-drenched streets. Children ran through puddles, cars splashed by, and life went on as if mine hadn't just been erased. I thought about Daniel's small smile, the forged signature, the judge's hammer. I thought about how truth in that courtroom had no sound at all. Only paper did. And when the gates of the prison loomed ahead, high and endless, I realized that this gray day, was the beginning of a life I'd never asked for. The first thing that hit me wasn't the smell, though God knows I'll never forget it. It was the sound. A heavy metallic rhythm, doors clanging shut, boots striking concrete, voices echoing down narrow halls that never seemed to end. It was a chorus of things I couldn't yet understand. Anger, laughter, pain, that all rolled into one long endless note that said, "You don't belong here." But it doesn't matter. They took my clothes, my belt, my name. In exchange, they gave me a number and a uniform that smelled of bleach and fear. The guard who handed it over, a man named Torres, I think, didn't look at me when he said, "You'll get used to it." I wanted to tell him I wouldn't, that I didn't belong. But I just nodded because my throat had gone dry. The cell was smaller than my daughter's bedroom. Cinder-block walls painted the color of old teeth, a thin mattress on a metal frame, a toilet in the corner, no curtain, no privacy. I stood there staring at it like I'd stepped into another man's nightmare. "Lawson!" a voice barked. I turned. A guard gestured down the hall. "Let's move." They walked me past rows of faces, men watching from behind bars. Some smiled without humor, others just stared. I heard words I didn't yet understand. Nicknames, threats, jokes. It was like being dropped into a language built on fear. "New meat," someone muttered as I passed. Another voice said, "He looks clean." Laughter followed me like a trail. When they locked me in my cell, the door slammed with a sound so final it rattled something inside me. My cellmate was a wiry man with a thin mustache and eyes too old for his face. "You Eddie?" he asked, voice rough from smoke. "Yeah, name's Sammy Pierce," he offered his hand. I hesitated, then shook it. His grip was firm. "First time in?" he asked. "Last time too," I said. He smiled a little. "Everybody says that." That night, the prison hummed with noise. Radios muffled through walls, metal beds creaking, someone crying down the hall. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks that looked like rivers on an old map. I thought of Margaret's hands, of Clara's laughter, of my father's porch light that I used to see from the road when coming home late. I wondered if he'd left it on that night waiting for me. I wondered when he'd turn it off. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the courtroom, the faces of people who once knew me. I saw Harold Benton's mouth pressed into a thin line. I saw Daniel's calm, empty smile. And I kept thinking, what if this is it? What if this is where I die? Morning in prison doesn't start with sunlight. It starts with metal. Keys in locks, boots on the floor, someone shouting numbers. 521, up! I sat up too fast and hit my head on the metal frame above. Sammy laughed. "You'll learn," he said. "They marched us to breakfast. Oatmeal that tasted like nothing, coffee that tasted worse." I sat at a table alone until Sammy dropped his tray across from mine. "Don't do that," he said quietly. "Don't sit by yourself. Makes you a target. A target for what?" I asked. He smirked. "For everyone." He introduced me to a few others. Old-timers. Men who'd made peace with their cages. There was Curtis, who'd been inside since '72, and Frank Piano Lawson, no relation, who'd lost 2 fingers but still played tunes on the table with a spoon. They weren't cruel, just broken in a way that made me ache. I remember thinking, these men used to have homes too. That afternoon, a guard named Hines, not yet the warden but close, assigned me to laundry detail. "Keep your head down," Sammy whispered as we walked. "Work's easy, but the men watching you ain't." The laundry room smelled of detergent and heat, a strange mix of clean and dirty at once. Piles of uniforms, sweat-stained and torn, passed through my hands, each one a piece of someone else's story. During a break, Sammy leaned on the counter smoking. "What did they get you for?" he asked. "Something I didn't do," he laughed softly. "That makes 2 of us. You mean it?" "Doesn't matter," he said. "Then here, truth's just a story no one's buying." That line stuck with me. Truth's just a story no one's buying. I repeated it that night, lying awake, the sound of chains and snores blending into something close to music. I tried to picture the sun outside, the streets, my daughter walking to school. I could almost smell her shampoo, the cheap strawberry kind. And then the thought came, sharp and sudden. She's going to grow up without me. I turned my face to the wall and whispered a prayer I didn't believe in. By the 3rd night, I understood the rhythm of the place, the counts, the sirens, the silences. Silence was the worst. It came heavy, thick, full of what nobody said out loud. In that silence, guilt and anger wrestled inside me until I couldn't tell which one was which. Sammy caught me staring through the bars. "You keep looking out like someone's coming for you," he said. "Ain't nobody coming, Eddie. Not till they need something." I didn't answer. I couldn't tell him that every time a guard's footsteps echoed, part of me hoped it was someone saying it had all been a mistake. That Harold had confessed. That Daniel had slipped up. That I could go home. Instead, a voice boomed down the hall. "Lights out!" And the prison sank into darkness. I lay there listening to the rain tapping the roof, a sound so familiar it hurt. I thought of Margaret again, how she hated sleeping during storms. She used to reach for my hand in the dark. I'd squeeze it twice in our little signal for "I'm here." That night I reached for air and squeezed nothing, and I knew the worst part wasn't the sentence. It was the knowing that the world kept spinning without me. My daughter growing, my wife crying, the house standing still, and I couldn't reach through the bars to stop time from taking them. The cell felt smaller than ever. The air thick, heavy. I closed my eyes and whispered her name, Clara, just to remember what love sounded like. And somewhere in that darkness, with the echoes of other men's nightmares rolling through the walls, I realized I had entered a new kind of forever. Time moves differently in prison. Outside, days are measured by weather, birthdays and holidays. Inside, they're counted by meal trays, by shifts, by the sound of locks turning in rhythm. The first year I marked every day on the wall with a pencil, "Sammy smuggled from the laundry." The second year I stopped counting. The marks didn't mean freedom anymore. They just meant survival. Every morning began the same, the rattle of keys, the bark of names, the scrape of metal on concrete. I learned to move in silence, to follow rules so closely they became part of my skin. "Keep your head down, Lawson," the guards would say. "Do your time, don't make waves." But how do you do time when time is all you have left? Sammy kept me sane those early years. He had a way of making the place feel almost human. We'd play cards, trade stories about the outside. He used to talk about his sister's kids, how he'd buy them bicycles when he got out. "They'll forget me," he'd say, smiling like it didn't hurt. Kids forget fast. I never told him that my daughter had already stopped writing. Her last letter came 6 months in, a short note written in a child's scrawl. "Mum says you'll be home soon. I love you, Daddy." I read it until the paper wore thin. After a while, letters stopped altogether. Margaret wrote less and less. Her words became shorter, colder. "Bills are piling up. Clara's fine. Please stop asking about appeals." Then nothing. Just silence. I kept waiting for the next envelope that never came. When mail call echoed through the block, I still looked up every time, just in case. Hope's a stubborn thing. It stays even when everything else dies. One night, Sammy found me sitting on my bunk, staring at that last letter. "You still holding on to ghosts, Eddie?" he asked. "They're not ghosts," I said. "They're my family," he nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I meant." The years started bleeding together. Seasons didn't mean anything, only the temperature did. Summer was unbearable. The air turned thick, suffocating. Winter was better, quieter, fewer fights, fewer smells. I worked the laundry for 15 years straight. Same machines, same burns on my hands, same clock that ticked without mercy. Sometimes I'd look at the steam rising from the dryers and imagine it was fog on the Kentucky hills. That helped for a minute or two. Every now and then new inmates came in, eyes wide, hearts still beating too fast. So I'd see myself in them, the disbelief, the denial. I tried to help a few, teach them how to survive. "Don't pick fights you can't win," I'd say. "Don't owe anyone favors." Some listened, some didn't. Most didn't last long. Father Leonard McBride, the prison chaplain, started visiting me around my 10th year. He had soft hands and a kind face that time hadn't quite managed to break. "You ever talk to God, Edward?" he asked one afternoon while I folded sheets. "Not since he stopped listening," I said. He smiled sadly. "He listens. If you just stopped talking loud enough, he'd bring me books, old Bibles, worn novels. I read of mice and men 5 times. The story about dreams crushed under the weight of life felt like someone had written it just for us. "You should write your story," he said once. "Tell people what happened." I laughed. "Nobody wants to read about a convict." "Then write it for yourself," he answered, "so you don't forget who you were." That night I found a scrap of paper and started writing. Not for anyone else, just to remember. I wrote about Margaret's laugh, about Clara's missing tooth, about the smell of coffee and rain. Every word felt like breathing again. I hid those pages under my mattress for years. Sammy died in his 22nd year inside. Stroke, they said. Quick and quiet. They let me stand by the chapel wall during the service. No family, no photos, just a wooden box and the sound of Father McBride's trembling voice. When it ended, I went back to my cell and sat in silence. I didn't cry. I'd run out of tears years before. But that night, I dreamed of him sitting by the laundry machine, smiling, saying, "Truth's just a story no one's buying." After Sammy's death, something inside me hardened. I stopped hoping for news from home. I stopped counting years. I just existed. One day, during my 25th year, I got a letter, not from Margaret or Clara, but from the state. My father, Walter Lawson, had died of a heart attack. The paper said, "Next of kin notification. No condolences, no ceremony. Just a formality." I sat on my bunk staring at it until the words blurred. That night, Father McBride came to check on me. "You okay, Edward?" he asked. I handed him the paper. He read it quietly, then placed a hand on my shoulder. "You should pray for him," he said. I shook my head. "He prayed for me my whole life, Father. Look how that turned out." He didn't answer. He just bowed his head and prayed anyway. I didn't stop him. Years of dust and silence. That's what I remember most. The dust that settled on the window bars every morning. The silence that filled the room after count. When all you could hear was breathing. Hundreds of men waiting for something that would never come. I was 58 the day they transferred me to another block. My hair had turned grey, my hands stiff from arthritis. New guards, new faces, same walls, but something inside me had changed. A strange calm, maybe acceptance. I wasn't the man who'd walked into Benton Manufacturing that October morning. I was what was left of him. That night I sat by the tiny window and watched the moon rise. For the first time in years I whispered my daughter's name, Clara. It came out dry, almost foreign. I wondered if she'd remember my voice. The next morning I woke up to the sound of a new inmate arriving, a young man, barely 20. He looked terrified, and when he sat across from me at breakfast he asked, "You really been in here 30 years?" 36 come spring, I said. He blinked as if I'd said something impossible. "You ever think about getting out?" he asked. I smiled. Not bitter, not sad, just small. "Every day," I said, "but thinking about it doesn't open the door." And as I said it, something deep in me whispered, "Not yet." The visiting room always smelled like vending machine coffee and lemon pledge, like someone's idea of clean spread thin over old grief. Plastic chairs scraped the concrete, as families tried to sit close enough to pretend the distance wasn't there. That day, in my 12th year inside, Margaret came in with a scarf wrapped tight around her neck, and a look that told me before she spoke that something had shifted. Clara was 13 now, tall as the doorway, hair braided like her mother's used to be when we were young enough to think time had manners. Officer Torres waved them through, tapping his watch, and I stood, hands on the table, trying not to look hungry for their faces. "Hi," Margaret said, and her voice reached me the way a radio station does when you're halfway out of range. There, but fuzzed. Clara didn't sit. She stared at the rules posted on the wall. No touching beyond a brief embrace, hello and goodbye. I watched her read the same line twice. "How's school?" I asked. "Fine," she said, the word so tight it might snap. Margaret dug for quarters, feeding the machine a gentle patience she no longer gave me. A Dr. Pepper clunked into the tray and startled all three of us. "I can't keep coming every month," she said, eyes on the soda, not on me. "It's the drive, the money, the looks at church." I opened my mouth with all the obvious replies. I didn't do it. "Hold on, please," but they lined up and refused to march. She pushed the can toward me like a peace offering. "We have to think about what's best for Clara." The can hissed when I cracked it, and the sweet burn of sugar and chemicals was suddenly the most complicated kindness in the world. "What do you want me to say?" I asked. She met my eyes then, and what I saw was a woman who'd tried to carry a house on her back for 12 winters. "Say you understand." I did, because loving someone is sometimes pretending you agree while your whole body says no. The goodbye embrace was quick. Clara smelled like strawberry shampoo and rain. She didn't say "I love you." As the door swallowed them, a chair scraped hard behind me, and Warden Hines's shadow fell long across the floor like a sundial, pointing at the end of something I'd been pretending wasn't ending. The letter came a year later, thin as a sigh. It was postmarked from Cincinnati. I recognized Margaret's looping handwriting and felt my pulse in my gums. Father McBride stood beside my bunk, as if he'd known this envelope would weigh more than I could lift. "You want me to leave?" he asked. "No," I said, and tore it open. The first line told the story without ceremony. "Edward, I've filed for divorce." The word sat in the middle of the page like a black nail. She wrote about bills, about nights she couldn't sleep for listening to the house creak like it was trying to speak, about Clara needing a father who wasn't a ghost on visiting days. She said she'd met someone at church, Alan Whitfield, a widower who fixed things with his hands and could change a tire without swearing. "He's kind," she wrote, and the word cut deeper than cruel would have. At the bottom, "Please sign. If you ever loved me, don't make this harder." The pen felt heavy, too heavy for a man who no longer owned anything of weight. I stared at the spot where my wedding ring used to polish the skin and remembered how the intake officer had slid it into a tray and promised I'd get it back. I never did. "You don't have to sign today," Father McBride said gently. "Tomorrow looks the same in here," I answered, and the pen scratched my name across that thin line like a match struck in rain. I kept the papers under my pillow for a week, as if the ache might flatten under my head. At night, the cell carried every sound. Men laughing at jokes that weren't funny, someone praying in Spanish, the click of brass keys moving down the tier. Sammy, already thinner from the cough that would later steal him, lay with his hands folded and his eyes open. "You're not wrong to sign," he said. "You gave her back her life." I wanted to ask where mine went. The next mail call, I sent the envelope back. My signature a grey echo of the man who'd promised 30 years earlier to stay. The guard slid it into the outgoing slot without looking at my face. When the slot clanged shut, all the air left my body like I'd been punched. Father McBride patted my shoulder, the gesture of a man trying to bless a forest fire. "God wastes nothing," he said. "He's wasting me," I answered, and the chaplain didn't argue. He only stood there, silent, until the count bell rang and we separated like men walking away from the same grave, with different stories about who was buried there. After the divorce, time lost its corners. Days slid into each other. I stopped expecting my name at mail call. When an envelope did arrive, thick, official, addressed in a stranger's hand, it was stamped "Return to sender" above my letter from 3 months earlier to Clara. The pink sticker carried a sentence colder than any I'd been given. Recipient moved. Forwarding expired. I stared at the rectangle of absence where a new address could have lived, and it felt like someone had erased a door I didn't know I'd still been walking toward. Paul Granger wrote once, a short card with a picture of a lighthouse on the front. Heard Margaret remarried. Saw Clara at a grocery in Newport. Didn't say anything. Didn't think I should. I hope you're holding up. I tore the card in half, then taped it together and hid it with the rest of my paper life because even anger is a kind of proof that you were there. Nights grew longer. In the laundry, I handled uniforms stitched with other men's names and tried not to imagine Alan Whitfield mowing a yard that used to be mine. The porch light I'd paid for Amber against a Kentucky dusk, Clara, 18 now, stepping out into her life without looking back. One evening during count, my knees just buckled. No warning, no drama. The floor met me hard. The chorus rose, "Man down!" And then the echo of boots, the cold attention of a dozen eyes. In the infirmary, a nurse with kind wrists said it was stress, blood pressure, grief. Like there's a difference when you've been emptied. She gave me pills that made my mouth taste like coins and told me to rest. Rest from what? From losing the shape of my own name in other people's mouths? Back in the block, the lights dimmed to that dirty twilight the prison calls night. I stood at the bars and looked for a sky that couldn't see me. Father McBride appeared as if conjured, with a paper cup of tap water, and a look that made me feel 12 and 48 all at once. "Edward," he said, "I need you to sit." His voice was different, careful, like he was walking over ice that might not care who he was. My hands went cold. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away, and in that breath I smelled my mother's Sunday roast, heard my father's laugh float off the porch, tasted the metallic blush of the Dr. Pepper Margaret had pushed across the table the day she asked me to understand. The chaplain swallowed. "It's your mother," he said softly. "Mary." His fingers tightened around the cup, and for a second I wished I could float backward into any moment before this one, any door that didn't open into another room of loss. "Edward," he said again, "there's been—" The tear alarm shrieked, the lights flashed red, and his words were swallowed by the prison's howl just as the officer's keys rattled toward my cell. They told me the next morning, in the warden's office, while the hum of fluorescent lights buzzed like a swarm of flies around something already dead. Warden Hines kept his voice flat, as if emotion were a privilege I no longer deserved. "Your mother passed last night," he said, eyes flicking once to the folder in front of him. "Heart failure. Your sister-in-law handled arrangements. I didn't have a sister-in-law, but I didn't correct him." The words came at me like wind through broken glass. "When's the service?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Tomorrow. But you can't attend, Lawson. Security, transportation, cost." You understand, I didn't. Not really. Father McBride stood in the corner, hands clasped. "I can arrange a small memorial here," he offered. Hines nodded, relieved to hand off the weight. "Do that," he said, and left us alone. The chaplain waited until the door shut before stepping closer. "Edward," he began softly, "would you like to say anything for her?" I shook my head. Words felt dangerous. They carried too much. He pressed a small wooden cross into my hand, the kind you give children at Sunday school. "She prayed for you every night," he said. I wanted to ask why didn't it work, but the words never made it out. That evening I sat on my bunk staring at the cross. My hands were rough, scarred from years of laundry work, but I held it like it was glass. Sammy was gone by then, his bed empty, sheets folded tight. The silence of that space made everything louder. Every chain clink, every cough, every breath of men I didn't know. I thought about my mother's hands, how they used to smell of flour and lavender soap, how she'd smooth my hair before church and whisper, "You're my good boy, Edward." I wondered if she still believed that when she took her last breath. I wondered if she forgave me for not being there. That night I wrote her a letter. It started with Mama and ended somewhere between prayer and confession. I wrote until my fingers cramped, until the pencil broke. I didn't sign it. I folded it carefully and slid it beneath my pillow. When the lights went out, I whispered it again in the dark, each word a way of pretending she could still hear me. The memorial took place in the chapel 2 days later. 6 inmates, Father McBride and me. He lit a single candle. its flame trembling in the stale air. "Blessed are those who mourn," he read. The others bowed their heads, some in respect, some just for rest. I stared at that candle until the wax pooled and spilled down its side like tears that refused to fall from my own eyes. "Would you like to say something?" the priest asked. I stood, the wooden floor creaking under my feet. My throat tightened around the words. "My mother," I began, "was the kind of woman who could make soup out of nothing. She prayed for rain and baked when it came. She believed the world was fair." My voice cracked. She was wrong about that. Father McBride gave me a look, gentle, warning, but I kept going. "She believed truth always wins. But truth doesn't always get a turn." I looked at the other men, all of them broken in their own ways. "She believed in heaven," I said, quieter now. "So I hope she's there, because she deserved somewhere better than this." The chapel stayed silent after I sat. The candle flickered once, then steadied. Father McBride whispered something I couldn't catch, and the room emptied out. I stayed behind, staring at the little puddle of wax cooling on the table. The smell of burning wick reminded me of Sunday mornings. Bacon, coffee, my father humming along to Hank Williams. For a moment I could almost hear it again. Later in the yard, a guard called my name. "Mail," he said, handing me an envelope thick with official seals. My heart kicked once, stupidly hopeful. Inside was a notice from the state of Kentucky. Death certificate enclosed. Next of kin, Edward Lawson incarcerated. There was no letter, no message, just paperwork. I folded it into fourths and slipped it into the same envelope that once held my divorce papers. I kept them together. Somehow they belonged to the same story. That night I dreamt of home. Not as it was, but as it might have been if none of this had happened. I was sitting at the kitchen table. My mother humming, Margaret laughing, Clara drawing suns that never stayed in the lines. In the dream, I reached out to touch her hand and it turned to dust. When I woke, the cell was cold. My pillow was damp. Weeks passed. Father McBride checked on me often, his footsteps soft outside my cell. "So you're angry," he said once. "You should be. But don't let it turn you to stone." I smiled without humor. "Stone doesn't feel pain," I said. "Might be better that way." I went back to work in the laundry because what else was there? Routine was the only prayer I had left. Fold, press, stack, repeat. I told myself I'd stop remembering, but memory has a way of surviving where hope dies. Sometimes I'd catch the faint scent of lavender on a sheet and feel my chest tighten. Once, while loading a dryer, I found a single white button that had fallen loose from someone's shirt. I kept it in my pocket for weeks, rubbing it between my fingers like a worry stone. It reminded me of the buttons my mother used to sew on my Sunday shirts, her needle flashing quick and sure. One night, the sky outside the narrow window turned pink before fading to black. I sat on my bunk holding that button, thinking about everything I'd lost. Margaret's warmth, Clara's laughter, my father's quiet faith, my mother's prayers. I whispered into the dark, "I'll make this right someday." I swear it, the words didn't echo. The air swallowed them whole. Somewhere down the hall a man began to sing, a low broken hum that didn't belong to any song I knew. I closed my eyes and listened, letting the sound fill the hollow places inside me. It wasn't peace, but it was close enough to remember what peace used to feel like. That's when I realized grief doesn't stop when someone dies. It just changes its name and stays with you. And as I drifted towards sleep, the last thing I saw was that candle flame from the chapel, still burning somewhere, refusing to go out. They moved me to records detail for a week because the laundry dryers were down and the prison never wastes idle hands. Records smelled like cardboard breath and old glue, a papery sweet rot that clung to your throat. I spent hours in a cinder block room with a humming fluorescent tube that made everything look the same shade of tired. My job was simple: sort, stamp, stack. Chain my mind to the list in front of me so it wouldn't go wandering where the pain lives. On day 3, a cart rolled in with boxes from the county warehouse, their sides furred with dust. "Archives, clean up," Officer Jenkins grunted, wheeling them in like sacks of potatoes. Someone had scribbled on the lid of the top box in fading blue, "Benton Meffy, Finance, 1986-88. The word swam for a second. My stomach did a quiet, ugly somersault. I told myself not to look. I told myself to keep my head down, to be the kind of inmate who never gets curious. But my fingers had their own memory. I eased the lid up an inch and the smell hit me. Paper and time. On top, bank-stamped envelopes wrapped in a rubber band pressed flat by years. Her name sticker flaked in my hand, D. Benton. For a beat, the room seemed to tilt, the chain of all my days tugging hard. I could hear the dryer drums in the laundry, the chapel bell, my mother's voice, all of it braided into a single sound that said, "Careful." I slipped the lid back on and stared at my own shaking hands, the scars, the ink stains that never washed out. I told myself I was a fool for hoping. I told myself it was nothing. And still the blue letters bled through the cardboard like a map to a door I'd never been allowed to touch. When the shift ended, I asked the guard for a bathroom break and splashed water on my face until the mirror stopped showing a stranger. When I came out, there she was, not a guard, not an inmate. A woman in a navy blazer, holding a spiral notebook to her chest like a shield, talking to Jenkins with her reporter's voice, calm and hungry. She had copper hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot and sensible shoes that didn't apologize to the floor. "Martha Collins," she said when Jenkins waved me past. "Courier Journal?" She glanced at the cart. "County sent me here by mistake. I was supposed to meet the clerk." "Long story." She said it like she could turn any long story into a sharp one. Our eyes caught for a second. It was nothing. It was everything. "Keep moving," Jenkins barked, breaking whatever thread had strung between us. I walked on, but in the corner of my eye I saw Martha tilt her head at the blue scrawl on that box, the way a hawk notices a field mouse's breath. She wrote something down. That night, lying on my bunk, the hum of the light in records still in my ears, I thought of that rubber-banded envelope stack with D. Benton sleeping on top like a confession. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself paper had betrayed me once and would do it again. And still I whispered to the dark, "Please." A word I hadn't used without bitterness in years. Down the tier someone laughed. The laugh turned to coughing. The coughing turned to a prayer. I closed my eyes and saw the blue letters a second before the lights died, and the darkness felt newly fragile, like a surface that could crack under the weight of a single name. 2 weeks later, the yard buzzed with a story that felt too ridiculous to hold. "Some newspaper lady," a guy from the wood shop said, "keeps calling about a box the county lost. News has a way of sliding through the bars no schedule can stop." I kept my face blank because hope can make a man look weak in here. But inside, something bent toward that rumor like a plant seeking a window. The next afternoon, during count, Officer Torres appeared outside my cell, a rare softness in his jaw. "Lawson," he said, "Chaplain wants you." The chapel smelled of wood polish and extinguished candles. Father McBride waited with a woman in that same navy blazer, her notebook tucked under her arm. "Mr. Lawson," she said, voice steady, "I'm Martha Collins." I nodded, slow, like the room might spook. "I'm looking into old financial crimes in Fayette County," she continued, "particularly cases where procedures were messy." She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. She set a photocopy on the pew between us, weighed down with a paperclip that knew too much. I found a box misfiled at a warehouse. Inside were bank microfilm printouts, deposit slips, and 2 letters. She slid the top copy forward with 2 fingers. "Commonwealth Bank. Deposit correction notice. Date 6 weeks before my arrest. Recipient Daniel Benton." My skin went cold, like the chaplain had opened a window I couldn't see. "Where did you get this?" I asked. Martha's mouth made a line. "It was signed out in 1990 by Detective Raymond Holt and never logged back. A clerk found it mislabeled during an insurance audit." The name Holt buzzed in my ear like a trapped fly. "They'll say it's nothing," I managed. "They always say it's nothing." Martha lifted her eyes. "It's not nothing," she said. "The correction notice mentions a temporary account set up under a vendor alias, Whitaker Supply, that rerouted funds for 72 hours before settling into a Benton-linked operating account. The signature authorizing the temporary account isn't yours." She inhaled. "It's Daniel's." I couldn't speak. The chapel floor tilted a degree left. Father McBride's hand hovered near my shoulder but didn't land. "I need to see the rest," I said. Martha nodded. "I can't share physical evidence without a court order, but I can tell you what I'm requesting. Full bank microfilm, audit memos, and Holt's chain of custody logs." She studied my face. "Do you have anyone on the outside to file motions?" "No," I said. "Not anymore." She scribbled, tore a page free, wrote a number on the back. Call attorney Rebecca Fields in Louisville. Tell her I sent you." She paused. "And Mr. Lawson. I don't know where this ends, but I know where it starts." She tapped the correction notice. The paper looked innocent. Paper always looks innocent before it decides who you are. I swallowed, feeling the old ache bloom in my chest like a storm that might break or not. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. Martha's smile sharpened at the edges. "Because I was 12 when my uncle did time for a thing he didn't do," she said softly. "And because this county misplaces the most interesting boxes." She stood, slid the copy back under her arm. "Father," she said, "thank you, to me. Hold on." Then she was gone, the chapel door's slow sigh following her out. I looked at McBride. He looked at me. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like the end of the road. It felt like the breath you take before you start to run. I called Rebecca from a phone that smelled like pennies and other men's secrets. Her voice had the kind of calm that comes from walking uphill a long time. "Martha briefed me," she said. "If there's a box, we'll find the lid and whatever's under it." 2 days later, she was in the visitation room with a tote bag of clipped articles and a patience that didn't condescend. "I can't promise miracles," she said, sliding me a copy of a 30-year-old memo with Holt's initials sprawled like a cattail in mud. "But I can promise motion." She traced a line with her pen. "See this?" Chain of custody closed, then reopened with no signature. "Sloppy. A judge won't like sloppy." I flinched at the word judge, but she kept going, steady as a metronome. "We'll petition to review original bank records." Not summaries, originals. Whitaker Supply was never a real vendor for Benton, but someone created it long enough to move money through an account that linked to an address 3 counties over. She flipped another page, and there it was. A photocopied bank application with the box authorized signer, filled in a hand that made my stomach clench. "Danielle Benton." She tapped it. "If I can authenticate this, if I can show a pattern, we have a lever." I closed my eyes. The room smelled like vending machine coffee and lemon pledge. The same scent of every hope and every goodbye. "What if they bury it?" I asked. "They might," she said, "but records don't sleep forever. They just wait for the right question." That night, back in the cell, I pulled the little wooden cross from my shelf and turned it in my hands. I thought of Martha's neat notes, Rebecca's cool, tireless finger tracing the line between then and now, and the blue scrawl on a cardboard lid that had looked like a dare from God. I thought of Harold's face in the courtroom and Daniel's small private smile. I thought of Clara, full grown now somewhere I didn't know, and of my mother, who believed truth always wins if you live long enough to watch it cross the finish line. The tear settled into its midnight noises, a cough, a snore, a whispered curse, the clink of distant keys like wind chimes in a bad dream. For the first time in 30-something years, I let myself picture a door opening toward me instead of away. I didn't call it freedom. I didn't dare. I called it a chance to ask a better question, but in the morning, news ran through the yard like a brush fire. Detective Holt had retired to Florida years ago, and Harold Benton's health was declining. Men told the story with the relish of gossip and the shrug of inevitability. I stood there with a plastic cup of weak juice warming in my hand and felt the ground shift again. The men who had drawn my life with their pens were fading. Would the paper fade with them? Would the ink confess? I looked up at a sky the color of dishwater and heard a freight train miles away cast its low, patient horn. For a heartbeat, I was back at the window at Benton Manufacturing, counting cars, believing in clocks that kept time and ledgers that balanced if you looked long enough. And then the CO shouted for count, and the spell broke. And I remembered where I was, where I had been, and where, impossibly, a stack of forgotten pages might be waiting to tell the truth out loud. Rebecca Fields didn't look like the kind of lawyer who'd show up for a man the world had already forgotten. No pearls, no tailored arrogance, just a dark blazer, a folder heavy with stubbornness, and eyes that had learned not to blink when truth got ugly. When she stepped into the visitation room, even the guard seemed unsure what to do with her presence. "Mr. Lawson," she said, extending a hand through the gap in the plexiglass, "I've been reading your life." Her voice carried the kind of steadiness that doesn't ask for permission. I took her hand, half expecting her to flinch at the calluses, but she didn't. She squeezed once, firm, human, before sitting. "I can't promise you freedom," she said first, "but I can promise movement. And sometimes that's how justice starts, with a shove instead of a miracle. For the next hour, she laid out the puzzle Martha Collins had started. Copies of deposit slips, bank memos, the correction notice signed by Daniel Benton. Each document was a bone in a long-buried skeleton. The tricky part, she said, is that we can't prove this was deliberately hidden. It could have been incompetence, misfiling, or a detective who didn't care enough to look twice, or someone who cared enough not to, I said. Her smile was small, almost sad. Exactly. She tapped the last page. A typed list of signatures pulled from old payroll authorizations. See this curve in the L of Lawson? Now look at Benton's. She slid another page across the counter. He mimicked your hand, but it wasn't perfect. He hesitated on the ascender. See that tremor? She looked up. Forgery analysts in the 80s didn't have the tech we have now. We can show this difference clear as daylight. Something inside me stirred. Not hope exactly, but its older cousin, defiance. You think this could overturn the conviction? I asked. It's a start, she said. We'll petition for a motion to vacate, based on newly discovered evidence. If the court agrees, they'll hold an evidentiary hearing. I laughed dry and low. You make it sound easy. She leaned forward. It isn't. The system doesn't like admitting it got the wrong man, but it likes paper. And now we've got paper that talks. As she packed her folder, I asked, why me? You don't even know me. Rebecca paused, hand on the zipper of her case. Maybe I don't, but I know men like you. I know what it costs to wait on someone else's conscience. She looked at me then, really looked, and said, You've already done the hard part. You survived. Then she left, her heels echoing down the hallway like punctuation marks at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. That night I sat on my bunk, heart thudding like a man remembering he still has one. Sammy's voice came back to me, the old line he used to say, Truth's just a story no one's buying. I whispered into the dark, Maybe someone's buying now. Weeks blurred into months, but Rebecca kept her word. Letters arrived every other Friday. Pages filled with updates written in neat, confident strokes. Filed motion for new trial. Waiting on judge's response. Located Benton's bank account records. Cross-referencing signatures. Each one felt like oxygen. I'd unfold them slowly, smoothing the creases with fingers that shook too much for a man who'd once been steady with numbers. Other inmates noticed. What's the suit want with you, old man? One of them, Derek Shaw, asked over lunch. He was young, 23 maybe, and carried his rage like a torch. I told him the short version. He whistled. If they clear you, that's a miracle. I don't believe in miracles, I said. Then believe in paper, he replied. Paper put you here. Maybe it'll let you out. Rebecca visited again in early spring. She looked different, exhaustion lining her face but fire in her eyes. The court's granted the motion, she said. We have a hearing date. The words hit me like thunder in a dry sky. They're reopening the case? A limited review, she clarified. But it's more than we had. The Benton family's lawyer is already trying to block access to Daniel's estate records. Estate? I asked, throat tight. Daniel's dead? She nodded. 3 years now. Heart attack in Chicago. But his son, Daniel Benton Jr., runs what's left of the company, and he's the one fighting disclosure. I let out a hollow laugh. The sins of the father, right? Rebecca studied me for a moment. Maybe not this time, she said quietly. Sometimes the next generation wants the truth more than the last. I didn't know what she meant until a month later, when she came back with a smile that didn't belong in a place like this. You'll want to sit down, she said. Daniel Benton Jr. reached out. My pulse quickened. Why? He found something, she said, in an old family safe. She opened her briefcase and slid a photograph through the slot, a yellowed copy of a company ledger page. There in faint pencil was a note scribbled at the bottom in Daniel Benton Sr.'s hand. DB withdrew temp funds, said for vendor float. Told him this could ruin us if discovered. I stared at that sentence until my vision blurred. That's his handwriting? Confirmed, Rebecca said. His son recognized it. We'll have it authenticated. I sat back, airless. For years I'd imagined this moment, the proof finally surfacing, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing over the bones of a life that never got to live. What happens now? I asked. Now, she said, we make the system listen. The hearing was scheduled for the following winter. In the months leading up to it, the prison felt different. Guards nodded with something close to respect. Even Warden Hines came to my cell one morning and said, "Heard your lawyer's making noise, Lawson. Good for you." I didn't know whether to thank him or laugh. Father McBride came by too. "You've carried this cross long enough," he said. I looked at the wooden cross on my shelf, the one he'd given me the day my mother died, and whispered, "Maybe it carried me." The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to Derek's soft snore across the cell, the pipes hissing like old snakes. My thoughts wandered to Margaret, to Clara. Would they know? Would they care? I imagined walking out to a world that had stopped waiting decades ago. When dawn came, the guards called my name. "Lawson, court transport." The words rang down the tier and every man looked up, some with envy, some with quiet respect. Derek gave me a nod. "Go see if Truth's still breathing," he said. As the van pulled away from the prison gates, frost glittered on the chain link and the sun cut through the haze like a thin blade. I watched it all shrink in the mirror, the walls, the watchtowers, the years, and thought of Rebecca's voice the first day she met me. Sometimes justice starts with a shove. I didn't know if the shove would move the world, but it had moved me. And for the first time in 36 years, the road ahead didn't look like a dead end. It looked like a door that might finally creak open. Rebecca sat me at the end of a long walnut table in a downtown Louisville conference room that smelled like lemon oil and old victories. To my left, Martha Collins stacked her notes like a mason laying brick. To my right, a man I'd never met stared at his own hands as if they were strangers. "Edward," Rebecca said, "this is Daniel Benton, Jr." He had Harold's square jaw and none of his armor. His tie was crooked, and there was a bruise-colored tired beneath his eyes you can't buy with money or lose with sleep. He slid a small fireproof bag across the table. The zipper made a sound like a cicada. Inside, a brass key taped to an index card, a bundle of check carbons bound with twine, and a spiral notebook so old the wire had rusted. "I emptied my grandfather's safe," he said. "The bank called after my father died. There was a box no one knew about." He swallowed. "He told me once, after his second heart scare, that our family's first rule was protect the name. I'm done with that." Rebecca opened the notebook. The first page held tidy lines in Daniel Benton Sr.'s hand, the same clean script I'd seen on Christmas cards to the staff. One entry was dated 6 weeks before my arrest. "Cash emergency. Margin call on personal act. D to move $147K briefly via Whitaker. Cover with vendor float." "Ask Holt lunch." The words staggered me. Even on paper, they pretended to be reasonable. Briefly, cover. Martha leaned in, her pencil still. "There's more," Daniel Jr. said, pushing over a brittle letter addressed to H. Benton with no stamp, never sent. The paper trembled in his fingers as he read aloud. "Harold will put it back by month's end. Lawson can take the heat if anyone asks. His initials are easy. He loops too much." "Don't worry." He stopped, eyes shining. "I didn't know my father like this," he whispered. "I thought he was hard, not cruel. I couldn't breathe." The room went a little far away, like I'd stood up too fast. "Why are you helping me?" I asked. He met my eyes. "Because if I don't, I live in a house built on a man's stolen life. Because my son deserves a last name that doesn't hide." He tapped the brass key. "The box at Commonwealth Savings holds microfilm reels and a cassette from one of my father's dictaphones. I haven't played it." The room's air changed. Even the HVAC seemed to listen. "Then we play it," Rebecca said, voice flat with purpose. The bank kept its safe deposit boxes in a basement that smelled of cold limestone and old coins. A clerk named Sylvia Cho checked our court order twice, then led us past 2 steel doors that shut like verdicts. When the key turned, time itself felt mechanical. Inside the box, we found 3 microfilm reels labeled Benton Ops, Q1 1986, a manila envelope marked Whitaker Supply, and the cassette tape in a cracked plastic case scrawled DB Notes. Rebecca held it in her palm like something hot. "We'll copy and preserve," she said, always the steward. Back upstairs, a borrowed microfilm reader glowed like a small, faithful moon. We scrolled until the world turned to tiny rivers of numbers. "There," Martha said, tapping the glass. "Transfers, corrections. A trail as thin and stubborn as fishing line, threading from Benton accounts to a shell that led to a P.O. box in LaPorte, Indiana." Rebecca's pen danced. "Whitaker wasn't a vendor," she said quietly. "It was a siphon. The cassette we played on an old Sony someone dug from storage. When the whir began, the room shrank. Paper sounds, a cough, a voice I knew better than my own nightmares. Daniel Benton Sr. Memo to self, he said, calm as weather. Temporary shortage. Took 147 from payroll path. Lawson initials cloned. Easy must coach Holt how to answer if asked. Return before quarter close. A chair scraped. The voice dropped. If Harold gets wind, I'll call it a reconciliation error. If Lawson sniffs it, let Dorsey push hard. The man was born to be believed, and I need him not to be. I felt something old and rusted give way inside me, a hinge that had held a door shut for 36 years. Martha's hand went to her mouth. Rebecca stopped the tape. We have to authenticate, she said, always precise, but this is the spine. Daniel Jr. stared at the player like it might apologize. I'm sorry, he said to no one and everyone. I'm sorry for my name. 2 days later, under oath in a narrow deposition room with beige walls that remembered other men's truths, Daniel Jr. signed an affidavit. The key, the box, the letter, the notebook. A forensic audio analyst named Dr. Carla Nguyen swore the voice matched recordings from a Benton shareholder meeting in '85. A retired bank manager, Alfred Pena, confirmed the correction notices and the temporary account. When the stenographer's machine clicked to a stop, Rebecca closed her folder with both hands, as if lowering a lid. This goes to Judge Elaine Monroe by Friday, she said. Then we asked to unmake what shouldn't have been made. I sat very still, listening to my own heart relearn a rhythm that wasn't built on grief. The story broke on a Sunday. Martha's headline didn't scream. It steadied. Misfiled box, missing chain of custody. Did Fayette County convict the wrong man? Neighbors I hadn't seen in decades called into radio shows with voices that tried to be surprised. The Courier-Journal's comments split along the country's favorite seams. Those who'd always believed, those who'd always doubted, those who said the system doesn't make mistakes, and those who said mistake is too small a word. In my cell, men slapped my shoulder, some because they felt it, some because hope is contagious and they wanted a dose. Warden Hines stopped by, awkward as a man at his own retirement party. If this goes your way, he said, you won't remember me. I looked at the gouges his ring had left in the paperwork he squeezed and thought, I will remember everything. Rebecca called at dusk. The line crackled. Judge Monroe has scheduled an evidentiary hearing, she said. 3 weeks. She also ordered the Commonwealth to produce all materials related to Detective Holt's chain of custody. I stared at the painted cinder block and saw a field of winter corn. And Harold? I asked. Silence, then. Hospice. The word landed like a soft hammer. She hesitated. He asked to see you. I felt the thinnest filament of anger hum. To say what? I don't know, she said, but he's asked twice. They took me under guard to St. Luke's Hospice. The room was all white noise, oxygen, quiet shoes, the murmurs of nurses who knew how to walk lightly around the end of things. Harold lay smaller than his legend, cheekbones like coat hangers under skin gone papery and apologetic. He blinked slow. Eddie, he rasped. The name landed in the air between us like a coin we both remembered using. I pulled the chair close. The guard stood by the door, a statue with a pulse. I heard the tape, I said. Harold stared at the ceiling as if it might forgive him. I knew he'd done something, he whispered. In '86, he came home with a new boat. He coughed, named it the Whitaker like he was daring God to call him out. His mouth quivered. I was a coward. I chose my blood over your life. The oxygen machine breathed for a man who'd run out of the right kind. Say it, I told him, my voice stone. Say he framed me. Harold's eyes found mine. He framed you, he said, the words dry as leaves. And I helped by not stopping it. He reached for me with a shaking hand. I didn't move. Please, he whispered. Forgive me. The machine hummed. The door clicked as a nurse passed. Somewhere a TV played a church service for people who couldn't get to one. I thought of a little girl drawing a sun too big for the page. I thought of the mug that used to hang on the hook by our stove. I thought of margins and corrections and a cassette that didn't care about anyone's last name. I leaned in so only he could hear. I forgive the man, I said, but not the choice. His eyes closed. For a heartbeat, I saw him in the Christmas lights of 1984, the proud boss with bourbon breath who'd called me family. When I stood, the guard shifted. Harold's finger twitched like it wanted to point at something he'd lost long ago. "Eddie," he said, almost a breath, "make it right." That night, back in my cell, the block settled into its nocturne. Coughs, snoring, a whispered argument, keys far away like rain on a tin roof. I took the little wooden cross from the shelf and set it on my chest. In 3 weeks, we'd walk into Judge Monroe's courtroom with paper that finally told the truth out loud. Martha would sit with her notebook. Rebecca would stand with her spine. Daniel Jr. would swear he was done protecting a name that had cost a man his life. And me? I would look at the empty chair where my mother should have been, where my father should have been, where a wife and daughter might have sat if time were kinder. The cassette's click still lived in my ear, the moment just before a voice becomes confession. I closed my eyes and heard it again, the soft clack of a door unlatching. Only this time it sounded like a gate. The morning of the hearing smelled like rain and disinfectant, that clean, hollow scent that hangs in courthouses before the world decides who's guilty today. They brought me in shackled at the wrists, but this time I didn't lower my eyes. I'd spent too many years staring at floors while other men rewrote my life. Rebecca walked beside me, her briefcase tight against her ribs. "Head high," she whispered. "They already buried you once. Let them see what they buried." The courtroom looked smaller than I remembered. Judge Elaine Monroe presided from the same bench, where men like me had once been turned into case numbers. She was younger than I expected, with the kind of steady expression you can't buy with power, only with pain. Martha sat 2 rows back, her notebook open. Daniel Benton Jr. was there too, shoulders square, jaw set. No reporters this time. Just rain tapping the high windows and the quiet hum of a truth that had waited too long to speak. When my case was called, the clerk's voice trembled. "Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Edward Lawson. Motion to vacate conviction." Rebecca stood. "Your Honor," she began, "we are here because of a box no one was supposed to find, a box that tells a different story." She spoke of chain of custody errors, misfiled evidence, and a confession trapped on a 36-year-old tape. She played it. The cassette static first, then that voice Daniel Benton Sr.'s. Smooth as poison. Lawson initials cloned easy. Must coach Holt how to answer if asked. The sound filled the room like a ghost learning to breathe. Judge Monroe leaned forward. The prosecutor, Alan Greer, shuffled papers, trying to mask his discomfort. "Your Honor, the tape is unverified hearsay. It's authenticated," Rebecca cut in, "by a forensic expert and by Benton's own son, who sits here ready to testify." Daniel Jr. took the stand. His voice cracked only once when he read his grandfather's note aloud. "Lawson can take the heat if anyone asks." He said it again, slower, as if he needed to taste each word. "My father framed an innocent man," he said. "My family owes him a life." When Rebecca called me to testify, the room tilted back to 1986. The oath felt strange in my mouth, words I'd spoken once when I still believed they meant something. "Mr. Lawson," Rebecca said softly, "tell the court what these 36 years have meant." I looked at the judge, at the ceiling, at the flag limp against its pole. "I lost everything," I said. "My wife, my parents, my daughter's childhood. I missed birthdays, funerals, first days of school. I missed the smell of my own house." I paused, but I didn't lose the truth. They tried to bury it, but the truth's like a weed. It grows where it isn't wanted. Judge Monroe's pen stopped moving. The silence that followed was so deep, it felt like the room was holding its breath. When the hearing broke for lunch, I sat with Rebecca in a side room, chains coiled at my feet. "How do you think it's going?" I asked. She sipped cold coffee. "Better than I dreamed," she said. "Worse than you deserve." I smiled a little. "That sounds about right." After the break, the Commonwealth tried its last defense, a tired claim that the evidence didn't meet clear and convincing standards. Rebecca stood again. "Your Honor," she said, "the state asks this man to stay in prison because it's easier than admitting it was wrong. If the law means anything, it must be able to correct itself." She paused, eyes locked on the judge. "Let the record show that Edward Lawson never stole a dime, but he paid more than anyone should." As she spoke, I felt something inside me loosen, like a knot pulled too long. I looked around that room and saw my entire life reflected in the faces of strangers. Pity, disbelief, maybe shame. And then Judge Monroe said, "Mr. Greer, sit down." The prosecutor froze. She turned to me. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice low, "I cannot give you back the years you lost, but I can give you your name." She lifted the order. "This conviction is vacated." The sound of her gavel wasn't thunder. It was quiet and a single human knock. But in that moment it was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. They unshackled me right there. My wrists were white where the metal had been, my hands trembling like they'd forgotten how to belong to me. Rebecca touched my shoulder. "It's over," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. Martha wiped her eyes and whispered, 36 years. Daniel Jr. stepped forward, but I couldn't look at him. Not yet. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was the pale color of a fresh page. I stood on the courthouse steps, breathing air that didn't taste of stone. Reporters called my name, cameras flashed, but the only thing I could see was the horizon, wide, impossible, waiting. Rebecca stood beside me. "What now?" she asked. I looked at the street, at the people passing by who didn't know my story, and said, "Now I try to remember who I was before they told me who I had to be." The wind caught the edges of her papers, scattering them like startled birds. I helped her gather them, laughing once, a sound I hadn't heard in my own throat for decades. For a moment, just one, it felt like time had opened a small door back into the world. But freedom, I would learn, is not the same as coming home. The day I walked out, the air felt too big, like it could swallow me whole. The guard at the gate, Officer Torres, the same one who'd been there when I arrived 36 years earlier, wouldn't meet my eyes. He pressed the release papers into my hand and said almost kindly, "Don't look back." The gate groaned open, heavy as history. Beyond it, the world shimmered in late summer heat, and the first breath I took outside the fence hurt. It actually hurt, sharp and sweet at the same time, like my lungs didn't remember how to hold air that hadn't been rationed. Rebecca stood waiting by a silver sedan, coat over one arm, eyes glinting with a kind of cautious pride. "You ready?" she asked. I looked down at my state-issued clothes, at shoes that weren't mine, at hands that trembled with age and disbelief. "No," I said, "but I guess that's the point." She smiled, opening the door for me like it was some sacred ritual. As we drove away, the prison shrank in the rearview mirror until it looked like a scar on the horizon. I watched it vanish, thinking of Sammy, of Father McBride, of all the men who'd never get to feel what I was feeling now. Rebecca turned on the radio. Some pop song played, bright, meaningless. I stared at the green blur of trees, each one too vivid, too alive. "It feels louder out here," I said. "That's freedom," she replied. "It's noisy. When we hit the city, I almost asked her to stop. Everything moved too fast. Billboards, screaming colors, cars honking, people talking to machines in their hands. Even the air smelled strange, exhaust and coffee and possibility. "You okay?" she asked at a red light. "Just catching up," I said. She took me to a diner off the interstate. The waitress poured coffee before I asked, and when I lifted the cup, my hand shook so bad I spilled some on the table. "Sorry," I muttered. "Don't be," Rebecca said. "You've earned the right to make a mess." I laughed, really laughed, and it came out rough, rusty. I hadn't used that sound in decades. The coffee was bitter, perfect. Halfway through a slice of pie, Rebecca asked, "Where do you want to go?" I stared out the window. Cars glinted in the sunlight. People carried on like it was just another Tuesday. "Home," I said. "If it still exists," she nodded. "Clara?" she asked softly. I nodded once. "If she'll see me." The drive to Newport took 4 hours. I spent all of it staring out the window, tracing the lines of towns I didn't recognize. Gas stations had turned into glass boxes, grocery stores into palaces. At one point we passed a park, and I saw a group of kids flying kites, their laughter sharp against the wind. I felt something break open in my chest. Joy, grief, I couldn't tell. When we reached the old neighborhood, I barely recognized it. My house, the house Margaret and I bought when Clara was born, was still there but smaller somehow, like time had pressed it inward. The porch I built by hand was gone, replaced by a new one painted white. A car I didn't know sat in the driveway. I didn't expect Margaret to be there. She'd moved years ago. But I walked up anyway, step by step, until I could see my reflection in the window. A woman opened the door, gray hair, kind eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. I cleared my throat. I used to live here, I said. She smiled softly. You must be Edward Lawson. We found your name scratched inside the garage door. My husband kept it. My breath caught. That was a long time ago, she nodded. Sometimes the past leaves things behind. She didn't ask why I was there, didn't ask what happened. She just said, would you like to see the backyard? I did. The elm tree was gone, but I could still picture it. The way its leaves used to scatter like confetti every fall. I thanked her and left before the moment turned to ache. Rebecca waited by the car, eyes searching mine. You okay? She asked. No, I said, but I'm free. We checked into a small roadside motel near the river. The clerk handed me the key with a polite smile, not recognizing my face from the news. The room smelled of detergent and silence. When Rebecca left for the night, I sat on the bed and stared at the television remote. 36 years, and the world had learned to do everything with buttons. I turned it on. Colors, faces, stories, all moving too fast to mean anything. I turned it off and listened to the quiet. The next morning, I walked down to the river. The Ohio shimmered gray-blue under a sky that looked almost merciful. I watched the water move and thought about time, how it keeps flowing even when you're stuck. A jogger passed, nodding politely, unaware that the man standing by the railing had spent more than half his life behind walls. I closed my eyes and whispered, I'm still here. When I opened them, I saw Rebecca standing on the embankment, phone in hand. She called, she said. My chest went tight. Clara? She nodded. She wants to see you. I couldn't speak. 36 years of silence, and now one word, and yes, was enough to knock the breath from me. I looked back at the river, its surface catching the sunlight in pieces, like fragments of something broken trying to shine again. I thought about that first day at Benton Manufacturing, about the mug by the stove, about all the versions of myself I'd lost and left behind. The gate's open now, Rebecca said. I nodded slowly. Yeah, I whispered. But walking through it, that's the hard part. Rebecca parked 2 houses down from the small white bungalow at the edge of town. The yard was neat, the kind of neat that says someone's been tending to their own ghosts for a long time. A blue bicycle leaned against the porch railing. Wind chimes tinkled softly in the morning air. She said she'd be home all day, Rebecca murmured, eyes searching mine. You don't have to do this now. I've been waiting 36 years, I said. Now's all I've got. I stepped out of the car, my knees stiff, heart drumming a rhythm my body didn't remember. Every step up that walkway felt heavier than the last. The door opened before I could knock. There she was, Clara Lawson, grown woman, mid-40s, eyes like her mother's but sharper. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with silver at the temples. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just looked at me like she was staring through time itself. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, You're really him. I'm really him, I said, voice trembling. The screen door creaked between us. She studied me, my wrinkled shirt, my sunken cheeks, the weight of years. You look like Grandpa Walter, she said. He used to sit on the porch and whistle hymns. Her eyes glistened. He said you didn't do it. He said someday people would see. I nodded, throat too tight to speak. She stepped aside. Come in. The living room was simple. Yellow curtains, the smell of cinnamon and lemon polish. On the mantel sat photographs. Her wedding, 2 children, a boy and a girl, smiling in soccer uniforms. My grandchildren. I stopped breathing. Clara followed my gaze. That's Henry, she said softly. And Ellie. They're beautiful, I managed. They don't know much, she said. Just that you were gone a long time. I was, I whispered. Too long. She motioned for me to sit, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't trust me. You want some coffee? She asked. I almost laughed. Coffee. The last thing I'd made before everything fell apart. Please. While she poured, I studied her hands. They were her mother's, long fingers, delicate, capable. I remembered those hands holding crayons. Clinging to mine as she crossed the street, she handed me a cup, then sat opposite, the table between us like a timeline. I read everything, she said quietly. The articles, the court decision, the hearing transcript. I didn't know whether to cry or scream. Neither did I. Her jaw trembled. Mom, she tried. She really did. But she was so tired, Dad. She was breaking in slow motion. I used to hear her crying in the kitchen after she thought I was asleep. I swallowed hard. I don't blame her. She kept me alive in here, I said, tapping my chest. Even after she stopped writing, we sat in silence. The clock ticked softly on the wall, a steady heartbeat for two people learning how to breathe the same air again. After a while, she brought out a small box. "This was Mom's," she said. "When she passed, I kept it. I didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to give it to you." Inside were photographs, old Polaroids faded around the edges. Me holding baby Clara at the fair, Margaret laughing in the kitchen, her family frozen before the storm. At the bottom was something small wrapped in tissue paper. "My wedding ring. They found it in a drawer when we sold the house," she said. I turned it in my hands, the gold dulled but whole. "I thought I'd never see this again." She looked down. "I thought I'd never see you again." The air between us felt heavy, full of words too sharp to touch. I wanted to ask about her life, her husband, the children. But everything I said would start with "I'm sorry." So I said it instead. "I'm sorry, Clara, for all of it. For missing everything. For not fighting harder. For not being there." She stared at her hands for a long moment, then whispered, "I used to hate you." The words hit like a stone, but she didn't stop. "When I was a kid, I thought you chose that job over us. That you must have done something terrible and just wouldn't admit it. I told people my father died because it was easier than the truth." I nodded, tears burning my eyes. "So you had every right to hate me." She looked up then, eyes glistening. "But I don't anymore." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. "You were stolen from me. From all of us." For a moment, time folded in half, and the child she'd been, the man I'd been, meeting in the middle. I held her hand, careful not to grip too hard, afraid the moment might shatter. We talked for hours, haltingly, carefully, about everything and nothing. She told me Margaret had passed 5 years earlier. "She never stopped keeping your picture by her bed," she said. "Even after she remarried." I closed my eyes. "She deserved peace," I murmured. When I finally stood to leave, the sun had started to sink behind the trees. Clara walked me to the door. "Will you come back?" she asked. "If you'll have me." She smiled faintly. "Bring stories next time. Not apologies." Outside, the air smelled of cut grass and rain. I looked back once. She stood in the doorway, framed by light. A silhouette that carried everything I'd lost and everything I'd somehow found again. When I reached the car, Rebecca was waiting with that quiet, knowing look. "How was it?" she asked. "Like opening a door that's been stuck for half a lifetime," I said. "Did it open?" I looked back at the house, the chimes swaying, the window glowing warm. "Yeah," I said softly, "just enough to see inside." And for the first time since I was 30 years old, I believed I might actually belong somewhere again. The first night I slept in my own bed, the silence scared me more than any cell ever did. No clanging doors, no keys, no men shouting down the tiers. Just quiet, so deep it pressed against my ears until I could hear my heartbeat. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan, the slow whirl of blades moving like time itself had learned to breathe again. Freedom, I realized, is its own kind of confinement. You can leave the cell, but you can't unlearn its shape. Rebecca had found me a small rental house outside Louisville. 2 rooms, 1 window that looked out over a patch of overgrown grass. It smelled of dust and new paint. The landlord, a kind old man named Mr. Talbot, left a note that said, "Welcome home, Mr. Lawson." I kept reading those words over and over, unsure if they belonged to me. For days I tried to live like a normal man. I bought groceries. I walked to the corner store for coffee and milk. I watched people hurry to jobs, to errands, to lives that still had purpose. No one looked twice at me. A gray-haired man with a limp and eyes that had seen too much. That anonymity should have felt like peace, but instead it felt like erasure. The nights were the hardest. The mattress dipped where another life should have been. Margaret's warmth, Clara's laughter, my father's snores from the next room. The house creaked and sighed like it was remembering for me. Sometimes I'd wake up at 2 a.m. convinced I was still inside, that the guard's flashlight would sweep across the floor any second. Freedom hadn't erased the fear. It had only changed its address. I kept the little wooden cross from Father McBride on the nightstand, next to the letter Martha had written after the story went national. "You taught people what endurance looks like," she'd said. "But endurance doesn't make you whole. It just proves you survived." And surviving, I was learning, was only half the battle. One morning, Clara came by with her children. The sound of their voices filled the house like sunlight through dirty glass. Henry ran his fingers across the deep grooves in the kitchen table and asked, "Grandpa, did you make these?" I smiled. "Not these, buddy. But I made one just like it a long time ago." He nodded solemnly, like I'd given him a secret worth keeping. Ellie climbed into my lap, all elbows and questions. "Did you really live in a castle with bars?" she asked. Clara started to scold her, but I laughed. "Something like that," I said. But I didn't like the view. We sat outside afterward, watching the wind stir the trees. Clara told me about her work, her husband, her life. Small details I collected like coins. "I wish Mom could see this," she said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. "She'd tell you to stop drinking so much coffee," she added with a faint smile. When they left, the house was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. Their laughter lingered in the walls. I walked through each room, touching the furniture, the door frames, the things that anchored me to a world that had forgotten my name, but somehow still had room for me. That night, I found the old box Clara had given me, the one with our photographs and my ring. I sat at the table and slipped the ring back on. It didn't fit anymore. My knuckles had swollen with age. Still, I wore it. It wasn't about marriage anymore. It was about remembering I'd once been loved in a world that made sense. Weeks passed. The world moved forward like it always does. The Benton name faded into history books and legal journals, a footnote about wrongful conviction. People said my story changed something, that laws were re-examined, that procedures tightened. Maybe they were right. But late at night, when I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and the river wind brushing my face, I didn't think about laws. I thought about time. Time, that thief that takes everything and still demands gratitude when it gives back a fraction. 36 years stolen. I'd gotten the truth, yes. I'd gotten freedom. But freedom without the years is like a photograph without the faces. I visited my parents' graves that autumn. The grass had grown tall around the stones. I brushed the dirt from my mother's name, whispered that I'd kept her faith alive just long enough for it to matter. "You were right," I told her. "Truth wins, but sometimes it limps across the finish line." Before leaving, I laid the small wooden cross between their headstones. "I don't need this anymore," I said softly. "You can keep it for me." That evening back home, I lit a candle and set it by the window. The flame trembled in the breeze, tiny but stubborn, like the one Father McBride had lit for her all those years ago. I sat in the dark and watched it dance until morning. When the sun rose, the house looked almost warm. For the first time, the silence didn't frighten me. It just was. I walked outside, the dew cold under my bare feet, and looked at the world I'd finally rejoined. Birds chattered. Cars passed. Life, indifferent and beautiful, kept going, and in that stillness I whispered, "I forgive you, Daniel. I forgive you, Harold. I forgive all of it." The words surprised me with how light they felt, because forgiveness, I learned, isn't for them. It's the only key left when the gate's already open. If you like this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.